Today's daf is daf Yud Beis, and we got up to Omar Rav Nachman Omar Rav, which is 4 lines down from the top. Ra echad shochat. Now, if Ruvain shechts an animal and Shimon saw the shechita from beginning to end, then there's nothing to talk about because we have a principle called Eid Echad Nebi Surin, and we trust one witness, and he testifies to the effect that the shechita was done properly. We could certainly rely on him. And that seems to be what Rav Nachman is telling us in the name of Rav. Imra mitchila ve'ad sof mutolechal mishchitasa. Which so far so good. I don't even know what the chiddush is here in Rav, unless he's trying to tell me that the seifa im lav, if he didn't see the shechita from beginning to end, which means that he only witnessed part of the shechita, and that part of the shechita obviously was a very good shechita, but he didn't see the end of the shechita. Also lechal mishchitasa. Now, who is the shochet? We said that Shimon is watching Ruvain. I mean, if Ruvain is an upstanding shochet, well established, then I don't even know if we need anybody other than Ruvain himself to testify about the shechita. So the Gemara immediately asks Seichitami, what's the case? If he's a well-known shochet, he knows the laws of shechita, he knows how to implement shechita, he's proven himself in the past, he has experience, a track record, then lama lira. Why do I even need anyone? And Rav sets it up as a precondition that I can only eat from the shechita because I have someone to testify about the shechita, and that someone, we call him Shimon, saw the shechita of Ruvain from beginning to end. The low gomar. On the other hand, if we know that this shochet is a total, shall I call it, I don't know if it sounds pejorative, but ignoramus as far as the laws of shechita is concerned, then pshita for sure, you can't rely on his shechita unless he saw it from beginning to end. So the Gemara now is going to come up with some middle of the road situation. Ela de lo yada I gomir I lo gomir. We really don't have any knowledge. He's not proven himself. Maybe he has, maybe he hasn't. We don't know. We don't identify him. Maybe he came from a different town and we never met him. So his identity as far as shechita is concerned, whether he knows the laws, he doesn't know the laws, is totally unknown. And in such a case, according to Rav, you can't rely on his shechita just simply because he picked up a chalif and he shechted an animal. You don't know whether he knows the laws. He doesn't know the laws. And if he doesn't know the laws, then he probably messed up the shechita big time. And it's treifa. How can you eat from that? So therefore, Rav makes a conditional that you were there to see the shechita from beginning to the end. Now you could, blast it out on the loudspeaker, and eidech and nebisur, and anyone could eat from that meat. So the Gemara says, you know what? If you're telling me that we don't know one way or the other as far as this shochet is concerned, then lema rov mitzuyin etzel shechita mumchen hein. I'm going to prove to you that the halacha relies on rov, that a person who picks up a chalif knife and goes ahead and shechts an animal, in all likelihood, and this is what the majority tells, he is someone who knows the laws of shechita, and therefore, once again, I should be able to rely on him and implement, or shall we say, and invoke the principle of rov mitzuyin etzel shechita mumchen hein, and I don't need him, I don't need anyone to watch the shechita. Milo Sanya, didn't we learn in a brisa? Now, the brisa is going to address a case, a very interesting case, where you found your animal shechted. I mean, you could identify the shechita, and as far as you know, it's a good shechita, but you have no clue who did the shechita. So therefore, remotza tarnagola shchuta v'shuk. So case number one in this brisa is that somebody, I don't know who, had the audacity to take your animal and shecht it, and you found it now geschochten in the shuk. Is then the Bryce is going to say, I'm skipping a few words for a second, cheskaso shachut. You could rely on the fact that the person from the shuk who went ahead and he implemented the shechita, he knows the laws of shechita. Oh, here's another case. Sha'omar l'shluchot say ushchot. v'holach u'motza shochet. So he knows that his shliach is a viable shochet, well proven, well respected. He passed all exams in Hilchos Shchita, but he's not sure if the shliach himself actually did the shchita, because the shliach flew the coop, and we don't know. Normally, we have a principle called chazaka shliach osa shlichuso. We assume that when you send a person to shlichus, that he will fulfill his shlichus, and therefore the Brisa says that chizkaso shachut. Alma, what do we see? What's the underlying principle of this Brisa? If you found your animal that was slaughtered and you could eat from it, Rinon, we must be assuming that Rov Mitzvah Shchita Mukhanachinami here too in our case. We don't know anything about this shochet. We cannot identify him. He came from who knows where. We don't know if he has the credentials for shchita, he has the knowledge, or he doesn't. So why not apply the principle of lema? We should say Rov Mitzvah Shchita Mukhaneh. And therefore, we come back full swing to square one. We don't understand why Rav says that in this case, we're not sure about the status of the shochet, that you must have someone who witnesses a shechita. Why do you need that? Why just not rely on Rav? Li'olam diyada delogam. You know what case we're dealing with? Rav is addressing a case where we know that this shochet has no experience whatsoever. He doesn't know the laws of shechita. He may get it right. Anybody could pick up a chalaf knife and maybe get it right. But kigo d'shocha kamon chad simon shapir. So now you're telling me that this guy is definitely not knowledgeable in the laws of shechita. How then can we rely on his shechita? And the answer is that we observed his shechita. Now, if we observed the shechita from beginning to end, then once again the question arises, why did Rav have to tell me that? Obviously, and that's a universal principle. But kigon the shacha kamon chad simon shapir. The supervisor dropped out right in the middle of the shechita. Very strange. After the shechita of one simon, which was done properly, and the supervisor testifies to that effect, now the supervisor flies the coop. And we have to understand, did the shochet follow through and do a proper shechita with the second simon? Mal did tame, if not for Rav, I would have said, Mida hai shapir, since he did a good job on the first simon, hach nami shapir, he must have done a very good job on the second simon. Kamashmalon says, Rav, that's not so. Could be high Isrami Visramile. It could be that just by chance, he got it right on the first pipe, on the first simon. But either when it came to the second simon, Shema perhaps, Shoha, Shema Doras. You remember these are the common psule shchita that we cannot identify. There's no way of knowing when you look at the throat of the animal after shchita whether or not the shochet took a break in the middle between one simon and the other, or whether or not he pressed the knife a little bit too hard and crushed and broke the simonim. So therefore, Rav says, if this guy, who we know about him, that he's lo yoda, he doesn't know the laws of shchita, and we want to be machshir shchita, the condition is that we've witnessed his shchita from beginning and the end, till the end, the whole shchita. It's not enough that we saw him shechting properly the first simon. That's not enough. Maybe when he got to the second simon, it was after shehiyah, or he was dores. And therefore, we need that you witness, or somebody witness, the shechita from beginning to end. In other words, can we rely on chazaka shliach osa shlichusa? You appointed him as your shliach. He went ahead and got lost, disappeared into thin air. And the question is, if you find your animal that was geshachted, can you assume that the shliach fulfilled his shlichus? Because again, if we don't assume that the shliach, who's a long-term expert, did the shchita, then perhaps somebody who doesn't know the laws of shchita did the shchita, and we can't rely on him unless we have witnesses. Meaning, that we certainly have the right to assume that the shliach, who's a professional at shchita, he was the one who did the shchita. So now the Gemara is going to posit a stira from an identical case in the laws of truma, meaning you sent the shliach to be mafresh your truma out there in the fields, and the shliach is einenu. He disappeared into thin air. Now you come back and you see that there was truma taken off. Well, if it was taken off by the shliach, then it's fine. He was your shliach. But if it was taken off by someone else, and we can't even ask the shliach because he disappeared, then that's called torem shalom midas chavero. I can't come into your field and be mafresh truma. And therefore, do we have a right to assume that the shliach was the one who did the afrashas truma? Because what? Because we have a chazaka that a shliach fulfills his shlichus amalei, and to our surprise, the answer that was given was ein chezkaso taru. Rav Nachman tells Rav Dimi, you know what? We're not going to resolve this problem by assuming that it was the shliach who was mafresh the truma, and therefore we cannot rely on this hafrash's truma. So I don't get it, says Rav Dimi. Manefshach, are you operating with chazaka shliach also shlichuso? If you are, then apply it straight across the board, consistently, even to the case of truma. And therefore I know that the shliach was the one who was mafresh the truma. Why is it that if you find, after you appointed the shliach, you find your animal geshachted, you're allowed to assume that it was the shliach who shechted the animal? There's an inconsistency here in Rav Nachman's rulings. Amalei, Rav Nachman responds to Rav Dimi's attack, and he says, you know what? Measure out for me a massive amount of salt. That's a common popular phrase in the Talmud, and it means, you know what, do me a favor. I'm going to explain to you what I have to say. Leolam ein chazaka shliach osa shliach. You cannot rely on the fact that a shliach fulfilled his commission. But ushchita, what's the worst case scenario? It wasn't the shliach who did the shchita, it was somebody else. So even if in the worst case scenario, Dilma he overheard me when I said to you, go check the animal, and he decided he's going to chap the mitzvah. Is rov mitzuyin etzel shchita mumchene? But in truma, we have a serious problem here. This guy who pops up from nowhere and he's mafresh my truma, he may have done a great job. He's also mumche. But dilma inish hakrina shom ve'osa v'torah mahavi le torim shalom midas v'torim shalom midas v'albayis ain't truma so truma. Because truma is fundamentally a haknoah to the Kohen. No one could come into my field and take away my fruits or my grains and be maknid and transfer them over to the Kohen. For that, it's got to be midas bailim. And therefore, if I assume that there's no such thing as a chazaka that a shliach will fulfill a shlichus, and somebody from the shuk came along and was mafresh my truma, it's truma shalom midas bailim, and therefore it's not truma. Now the Gemara wants to suggest that whether or not we rely on rov with regard to shchita is a machlokas tanoim. Lema, should we say that rov mitzuyin is shchita mumchanem tanoi? It's machlokas tanoim. Desanya, we learned in the price of haresha of du lo gidoyev v'tarnagolav. He got his goats and his chickens got lost. And he finds that somebody was slaughtered them. And here we have a machlokas whether or not we could assume that that person who we cannot identify was a mumche. Rav Yehuda Oser, Rav Yehuda says, how do you know that this guy who shechted your animals, I mean, he wasn't your shliach, he did it without your permission. Who says he's an expert? Don't eat from the animal. And why? Because he says that rov mitzuyin etzel shchita mumchin hem. Amar Rebbe, Rebbe wants to make a kind of a pshara, lahalach lamaisa. He says the following: Nirim dvarav shel Rabbi Yehuda. I'm going to rely on Rabbi Yehuda, and I'm going to have to be machmir kishem etza'an b'yashpa. Where did you find your animals geshachted? If you found it in the dumping grounds, then you know what? That's a simon mufak. That is a great indication that the shechita was not a good shechita. The animal's in a vela, and they threw it out, even though they could have theoretically sold the carcass, but we don't assume that something that, the carcass of a meat that's found in a dumping ground is kosher, was a good shechita. And therefore, we're going to accept Rabbi Yehuda b'kshematzav ha'ashba. However, says Rabbi, I'm going to accept Rabbi Chanina, benosh Rabbi Yossi, when kishematzon v'bayis, he finds the meat of the animal that was geshachted in his house. If it were an improper shechita, then they probably would have thrown it into the dumping ground. So the fact that they found it in the house is proof positive that the shochet did a proper shechita. Now, Rabbosai, if we had a whiteboard here, I would, this sketch of Rebbe who accepts Rabbi Yehuda l'chumra with regard to the ashpa back in the garbage dump, and accepts Rabbi Chanina l'kula in the case we found it in the bias. I would write that on the board because we're going to have to remember what did Rebbe present over here, and which halach did he accept. In any event, my lab miflagi, shouldn't we assume that according to Rabbi Chanina, who is mate the meat, even though you have no idea who shechted the goats or the chickens, Amrinan he holds Amrinan wrote between shchita mukhe. By the way, I just want to point out, just popped into my brain, that the Gaon Mivilna is famous for saying at the very beginning of Yoredeya that this is not just a classic rove, but it's almost vadai. And he therefore builds a theory that it's not even a latest hasofik. Umar Savar, according to Rabbi Yehuda, lo amrina rob mitzunei shchita mumchen. Therefore, if you find your animal geshachtin, you have to assume that maybe it was done by someone who's not professional. He's not accepted. He doesn't have his documentation. He never passed the test. He doesn't know the laws of shchita, and it's straightforward. Oh, Rav Nachman Yitzchak lo. This is not the way I want to interpret it, because in my opinion, Kuli Alma Rov Mitzun, everybody agrees that anyone who gets up and shechts an animal is a mumche. He's proficient. He knows what he's doing. Ubebayis Kuli Alma lo pligi d'shari. Even Rabbi Yehuda, who's the machmir here, would agree and concede that in the case where the animals were found in the house, that it's mutter to eat the meat, because Rov Mitzun it's a shchita mumche, and he didn't throw out the meat. Bi'ashba shabashuk is Kuli Alma lo pligi. I want to claim that even Rabbi Chanina, who is Mekir, would be modeh, that if you found the meat inside the shuk, but not just inside the shuk, but in the ashpa shabashuk, is then asur. Ki pligi, where is this machlokas? If everybody agrees that Rov Mitzun it's a shchita mumche, and everybody agrees that if you find it in the ashpa, it's treif. So where is the machlokas? Ki pligi be'ashpa shababayis. So again, everybody agrees that if you find it in the house, sitting on the table, then go ahead and make a barbecue. It's kosher meat. The machlokas is that you have a dumping ground in your house. You have a garbage pail. What do they call it? In England, they call it a trash, whatever word you use for it. Why was it put into the trash? Is Mar Savar, this is a big chiddush this is a simple shot. Mar Savar Rabbi Yehuda holds Adam asur lahatil bivlosa b'yashpo shebebayis. The shechita was not proper. There was a mistake, and they bungled up the shechita. The animal is now treif. And what does he do with treif? He could either schlep it all the way to the public dumping ground or put it in his own trash pan, and then he'll take it out later. He better not keep it there too long. Umar Savar, but according to Rav Chanina, whose makil allows you to eat the meat, you don't put things in your house that'll fashtunkazach, it's going to smell, it's going to rot away. Get rid of it, throw it into the public dumping ground. Let the wolves and the dogs eat it up. Anyway, we do find now that according to Rav Nachman Bar Yitzchak, everybody agrees, it's universally accepted that rov mitzvah netzel shchita mumchenim. But now we want to analyze the sheet of Rebbe. And until now, Rebbe made a pshara, and he accepted Rabbi Yehuda l'chumra. In the case we found it in the public dumping ground, he accepted Rav Chanina l'kula in a case we found it in the bias. Omar Rebbe nirim divrei Rabbi Yehuda shemitzah ba'ashpa. My ashpa, ilema ashpa shebeshuk. It can't be ashpa shebeshuk. It can't be the Rabbi Yehuda's referring to an ashpa shebeshuk. Everybody agrees that if it's ashpa shebeshuk, it's nevela. The kuliyamalo, right? We already established that kuliyamalo pligi de'asa. So how could there be a machlokas and Rebbe came to paskin like Rabbi Yehuda in the case of an ashpa shebeshuk? Impossible. El lapshita be ashpa shebebayis. Oh boy, now we're in trouble. Because now we're talking about ashpa shebebayis. And let's see how Rebbe paskins. Ema Seifa, v'divrei Rabbi Chanina b'noshe Rabbi Yossi aglu shemitzon b'bayis. Now you remember that Rebbe accepted Rabbi Chanina in the case of ashpa shebebayis. My bias, ilema bayis mamish, is how you already committed yourself to say that kuliyam lo pligi d'shari, right? You find it on the table in your dining room, you know that it's geschachten. Is then the only option that you can have is that we're talking about ela pshita b'ashpa shebebayis. It's in the trash can in the house, and Rabbi Chanina says that even though you found it in the trash can in the house, you could assume it was a kosher shchita because otherwise he would have taken it out to the public dumping ground. And now you're telling me, Rebbe, that in an ashpa shebebayis, everybody agrees it's mutter. Is kasha the Rebbe ad the Rebbe? So now we have a stira of two rulings of Rebbe.